Well, good evening, and thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful audience for a wonderful event. I'm Alan Brinkley. I'm the provost of the university, and it's with enormous pleasure that I introduce tonight's event. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge another happy event, which is really the occasion for this conversation tonight. Orhan Pamuk, as I think most of you know, has been a member of the faculty at Columbia now for 2 years, and has been a wonderful citizen of the university, in addition to being one of the great writers and in demand all over the world. So we're very privileged to have him here for at least part of the year. About 5 years ago, I initiated a professorship with help from the Mellon Foundation to help Columbia attract great humanists who might not be obvious candidates for appointments in conventional departments. And this was with the help of the Mellon Foundation and ultimately also with the help of a very generous gift from the Tam family in China. And with that money, we have created the Tam Professorship of the Humanities, the first of this new category of professorships. And so we're just very proud this evening that Orhan Pamuk has agreed to accept to be the first holder of this chair. And so tonight is mostly for all of us to hear this conversation between Orhan and Andreas Huyssen, but it's also a night to thank the Mellon Foundation, to thank the Tam family, neither of which unfortunately is represented here this evening, and to just express our pleasure at the thought of Orhan Pamuk, this great literary figure in the world, being a named professor here at Columbia. The conversation this evening is between a great writer and a great scholar, Andreas Huyssen, the Villard Professor of Germanic Languages and the chair of the Department of Germanic Languages, is going to conduct a conversation with Orhan Pamuk, Nobel Prize-winning novelist, who I think probably needs no introduction to anyone in this room. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the podium over, or not the podium, but the table over to Orhan and Andreas. And again, thank you all for coming.
Good evening. I guess first thing I should congratulate Orhan for this new honor, now that he's Professor Pamuk.
It's a great honor. Thank you very much. I feel I've always felt privileged being in Columbia. It's a sort of home for me in the United States. I'm so happy here to be here. Whenever I come back from Turkey, from Europe back here, I'm happy and I feel so relaxed, privileged, and also it's getting to be a pleasure to teach here. So I'm getting to be a sort of a professor. I hope not a professor like Nabokov's Pinin, but a regular professor.
Anyway, so welcome to this informal conversational session with Orhan. I mean, we of course have many occasions to speak with each other because, as it happens, we're co-teaching a seminar for the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society this fall, a seminar we also taught last fall, on the topic of word-picture relationships in a broad variety of philosophical, theoretical, art-critical, and literary texts. So I will start off our conversation today, ask a number of questions. We may deviate from the questions I prepared, but we play it by ear, and then we will have a brief discussion session with questions from the audience. Now, in recent years, Orhan Pamuk has been in the news so many times, both as a novelist and winner of the 2006 Nobel Prize for Literature, and as a political intellectual, a role he has, I think, admirably played but doesn't cherish all too much that I think I can forego a more detailed, extensive introduction here. Many of us have admired Orhan's writing for a number of years, and the Nobel Prize, of course, continues to win him many new admirers across the world. Most recently, I think at the Frankfurt Book Fair, which featured his most recent novel in German translation. It's not out in English yet, and where he delivered the keynote address on this year's organizing theme of the Frankfurt Book Fair, which was Turkish literature. So, Orhan, a little over a year ago, you published a book of essays entitled Other Colors, Essays and a Story, your first essay collection in English. Together with your wonderful memoir of Istanbul, it gives us insights not only about your formation as a writer, but also into the concerns and sensibilities that energize your narratives. I would like to draw a bit now on these essays to lead us into a conversation about the novel as a transnational genre, about the importance of the visual for your writing, about your understanding of the literary relations between, as it is often simplistically phrased, East and West, Turkey and Europe, and about your own practice as a voracious reader and a highly prolific writer. So, from these essays and from your memoir, we know that you once were going to be a painter. And at another moment of your life, you were going to be an architect. But then, happily, as I would say, you turned to the novel. But given that the novel is not, as a genre, has not been in the forefront of Turkish literature, can you say something about what prompted you to privilege this mode of writing, of a narrative, in which you have established such a unique voice?
Thank you. Yes, the art of the novel is not very is not a form that has been used so thoroughly as it was in Europe. But we have to remember that wherever the art of the novel it comes, it kills all the other forms or marginalizes all the other forms. Novels are inventions, literary forms when they reach to a new island, to a new culture, to a new place. Soon, like cancer, eat and finish all the other genres. That is something that should be explored, but that is how it is. In fact, I sometimes argue that literary globalization of the world has already been achieved almost 100 years ago. We are not aware of it. We are only talking about political and economical globalization. But that has been achieved, completed. In fact, sometimes my Turkish, especially on the realist novel. I have sometimes been criticized that it's not only I have sometimes been criticized back in Turkey for using more trendier, postmodern, experimental form. The say Flaubert, Balzac novel is so fully interiorized in Turkey that new generations think that it's a Turkish thing. Then they say experimental forms are things that come from West. That there is almost a sense that we have been using novel for quite a long time. Implementation of art, a form of art that comes from a different culture is problematical, but it is then on the other hand, we shouldn't dramatize those problems too much. That in the end, I think there is an elasticity in human mind to integrate to new forms, to see through what is happening in the local culture through the new forms. It's, okay. It's an interesting subject, but then all nations are doing, so that's Turks.
So I was just thinking, I was not wanting to cross that bridge of seeing you as a killer of other literary forms necessarily, because in your novels, of course, there are many instances where you actually rework Ottoman stories, stories and parables from India, and incorporate them into the novel.
Yes, once there is such a fast and strong social, cultural change, whatever your political convictions, whether you're conservative, whether you're liberal, it really doesn't matter. The fact that what to do with the, quote, tradition is always an issue. All the authors, no matter how experimental they are, feel this obligation to tradition. You may say, I don't care, I'm free. The way of history is something we consider, but then there is also human freedom, we don't care about this. Or you may deliberately maneuver around it, but the presence of the history, obligation to history, cultural weight, tradition, continuity, has always been more problematical in non-Western world, where we borrow the forms. Once you borrow the form, a way of expressing yourself, adapt yourself to a form, it gets to be problematical because you worry about belonging. You worry about addressing the readership. Forms imply philosophies. So if you write in a novel in a particular shape with a particular structure, then there is also a sort of a metaphysic, almost a worldview that go into making of that sort of form or adaptation of that this or that form of the novel. These this kind of quote importing or adapting different forms, of course, is problematical. First, that your way of addressing national audience is problematized by the reaction to it. Then also you feel a bit, quote, guilty, worried about continuity of the tradition. These are things that are happening to my work. I'm doing. I am also. I felt sometimes problematical using the word of art. But on the other hand, the main problem in Turkey with fiction, modern fiction, was that the tradition was tradition is Islamic tradition in the end, and then aspiration for westernization, modernization, to reconcile this aspiration of westernization, modernization with the tradition is again problematical, is not easy. The political consequences, the problems of addressing the man in the street, the reader in the street. Well, there are lots of problems there.
Well, I'd like to come back perhaps to this a little later again, but I think, you know, any reader of your fiction gets a sense of how important the realms of space and the visuality and the representation of the visual are for your writing. I mean, most paradigmatically, perhaps, in My Name is Red, a novel about the post-Renaissance relationship, Venetian painting and its relationship to the art of Ottoman miniatures. Not coincidentally, one of the sections of your book of essays is entitled Pictures and Texts. Mm-hmm. So I would like for you to address a little bit this relationship, which is, I think, so important for your narratives.
It's such a great subject for me, almost a sea of constellation of so many little nerve endings, so many little problems. I wanted to be a painter, and as I wrote and narrated in my autobiographical book, Istanbul, I was encouraged by my family to be a painter between the ages of 8 and 22. And I came from a family of civil engineers, so it was thought that it's natural for me to study architecture. Everyone said, you go to the same family school, but study architecture. In fact, I managed to enroll and won the examinations and begin studying architecture in 1970. After 3 years of studying architecture, suddenly one day, and continuing and hoping to be a painter, suddenly one day I stopped painting and began writing novels. And after that, 10 years later, when I successfully managed to implement myself as a national author writing books in Turkish, they have always asked me, Mr. Pamuk, you were going to be a painter, why did you stop? I don't have one single answer for that. Sometimes, with irony, I'll tell people that I wrote my book, Istanbul, as an answer to that. Between the lines, you can see why I stopped painting and studying architecture and one day began writing novels, but I don't have one single answer. I really, even if I really deny that answer. But after that, I also realized that I am, compared to other authors I know, a visual writer. With that I mean that some authors narrate stories through drama, through characters, while I feel tendency to draw a visual picture of being in this world. We can easily, if we think that there are authors novelists who narrate through pictures, Proust is one of them, Tolstoy is another one, Nabokov is another one. While, say, Dostoevsky, who reaches such depths that it's not easy not to be envious of him, he is not a visual writer. You read an memorable, very impressive scene from Dostoevsky. You remember so much, but you don't know what is in that room, what the character saw, or what the narrator saw. In that sense, I'm a visual writer. In fact, that writing a story and writing a novel is this, that you have the story, then you try to identify with the character. Most of the time, I felt myself, my tendency in me, that I see the world through narrators' first eyes rather than brain. So how does it feel in this room? Presence of the room. Presence of the character's eye, or what he sees in the room, is necessary for me to go into the story. Yeah. I can even say that sometimes I vulgarize my situation to explain it. Some people say, I think, therefore I am. That kind of Cartesian reasoning popularized. I sometimes say, I see, therefore I am. That I'm a visual person. I think in the end, literature is about the experience. Is about pinning down with words what it means to be alive in this world. Some of it is about culture, history, some of it about political problems or whatever, some of it are existential problems, so forth and so on. But for me, the first experience, the first step in being in this world should, I think, pin down visually, while other authors pin down it dramatically. It's not what I see in this world, what my conflict with this other person in this world is, some authors suggest, is their first step. While I think that I first start the world with a picture, with what I see, with the color, with the detail, the visual detail.
I understand now why you said that Istanbul, in a certain way, was a response to these questions, right? And because Istanbul is the one book where you actually do use photography, and the photography just by one photographer, right?
There are in Istanbul I use 50% or 55% of the photographs in Istanbul is by this prominent Turkish photographer Araguler. Some of them are from, and then there are also other photographers of 40s, 30s, 50s. Again, they are also journalistic photographers, and there are also some family photographs and also some photographs I took. But then they all have a black and white quality that represent the melancholy of the book. But there are sort of illustrations of the atmosphere of Istanbul of 60s, 70s, a black and white atmosphere that I read through, an atmosphere that represents poverty on the margins of Europe. So it's a feeling of melancholy, which also corresponds to an inevitable feeling of defeat at the edge of Europe. I also attribute to the presence attributed to the presence of ruins of Ottoman architecture, which was abundantly visually available in my childhood.
Well, with this, maybe this may segue into somewhat more political question I would like to ask. I mean, given that you kept your distance from programmatic political writing dominant in Turkey in the 1970s and the 1980s, it strikes me as ironic and yet highly significant that you've also become very visible as a political figure in your own country and in the world at large. But let me perhaps just summarize briefly for the audience here. I mean, 3 years ago, there were death threats against you after you had published, after you had publicly broken the taboo of not speaking about the Armenian genocide of 1915 and about the more recent war on the Kurds. You then spent a few months incognito, as it were, here in New York, and actually worked quietly in the library, in the Max Kade Library of Deutsches Haus, one of the few claims to fame of that space, I guess. Later that same year, you were put on trial for offending Turkishness in your country, punishable offense under paragraph 301 of the Turkish Penal Code. You were acquitted early in 2006, but the political threats, of course, remained, and this was driven home dramatically by the murder of your friend Hrant Dink, a Turkish-Armenian journalist and editor of a bilingual paper. Now, the question here, of course, is not whether or not the Armenian genocide was or was not a genocide. The central question rather concerns the freedom of expression. And the political question underlying this debate is what is and what will be Turkey's relationship to the European Union. Now, somewhere in the section called Politics, Europe and Other Problems of Being Oneself, in your book of essays, you speak of Europe both as a vision of the future and as a threat. And as a Turkish writer with close and creative relations to European literature, you know, where you have many readers across Europe, can you comment a little bit on the way you see the difficulties in the relationship between Turkey and the EU today and how they might or might not be resolved?
First of all, what happened to Ottoman Armenians, whether it's genocide or massacre, whatever the term you use to describe this, is, of course, as you said, an issue of freedom of speech. But besides that, it's an issue that goes deep into the modern Turkish nation spirit. That is why it's so dramatical. That's why it's so such a great taboo. But then the way I lived it, it's first and unfortunately an issue of freedom of speech, because we can't even talk about it, or those who talk about it take lots of risks, as in the case of Hrant Dink, who were simply shot and killed. Yes, but in real politics, it is also, of course, an issue of Turkey's negotiations with European Union. In real politics, then I have seen politicians only refer to that in that context. And then also, yes, it's part of that too, that once you have an open society, once you have a culture where everything is, that we can talk about everything, that this kind of society can only join the European Union is the argument, and I agree about that too. We have to be able to at least talk about it, no matter whatever you may be thinking about it, whatever concept you may be using to understand what happened. What I think of European Union, Turkey's European Union relationships, let me try to summarize my point of view, that for 2 or 3 years, between especially 1992 and 1996, I was out there, and my ideas about this was clear, and I still believe in those ideas, that I think that Turkey should join European Union, and not for cultural reasons, but for reasons of politics, and at a decent, to establish a decent country of law and order, and also to establish ethics in economy. So my considerations were more real political, real politics rather than philosophical, cultural. I want to see Turkey in European Union, essentially because I strongly believe that it will make Turkey make a more open society. We will have a full democracy, presence of the army in Turkish politics, the habit of intolerance, which is more a cultural issue really, will fade away a bit. So my motives in promoting European Union, that Turkey should be part of European Union as far as addressing Turkey's problems, is real politics. As far as I remember always being asked by European journalists and my Turkish friends who also agree, so how do we sell Turkey to Europe? How do we say how attractive that Turkey is also Turkey, Europeans, say, ruling elite of European Union. How do we sell Turkey? So to convince them that it's also for their benefit. My argument here is a bit abortive, a bit forceful, that I think that Europe will also be a real multicultural society if it's really based on not its own history and religion, but more fraternité, égalité, liberté. All these big, if Europe really believes in these big ideas, then they have to take Turkey, we argue. We should argue, defend Turkey's joining of European Union by that. There are pragmatists who say, well, there's such an immense market here. I don't buy that, but then that's, of course, a forceful argument. But I'm not much interested in that kind of thinking when I defend Turkey, when I propagate that Turkey and European Union should, in the end, reach an agreement. But then the negative side, you ask also damning.
No, because you said in the 90s you were thinking that way. What about now?
No, I'm thinking more or less thinking the same. But then there was also that it's damning in the end. That it's I have felt that so many Turks have this anxiety. What about our culture? They will swallow us. They will make us like themselves. We'll be like our peculiarities. Our character will dissolve. Well, at the heart of modern Turkish Republic lies Kemal Atatürk's reforms, and they were all about being like Europeans. The definition of modern Turkey is based on Kemal Atatürk's willing imitation of Europe. And since Turkey was never colonized, imitation of Europe, imitation of Western culture, and it's not imitation, I would say interiorization, is not as damningly, ethically problematical as, say, it would be in a culture, in a country where there will be wounds of colonization. It is easier for Turks to subscribe, even in a superficial way, to Western culture, Western ideas, without being totally guilty about it. But there is now such a resistance to it that its Westernization had always fueled political energy in Turkey.
Well, let's perhaps turn back to the novel again. I mean, the one really political novel, as many critics have pointed out, that you wrote is the novel Snow. But then, in some ways, I tend to read all of your novels in a political sense and in a much more subtle sense than that of taking positions, say, on the contemporary state, on the social conflicts between secularism and Islamism in Turkey, on censorship and the like. And it seems to me that your novels cross two thresholds, which are, as you've already suggested, key to Turkish culture, memory and politics today. And one threshold is, of course, the one described as Turkey and the West, which is key literarily and aesthetically for all of your novels. I mean, very pronounced in The White Castle and My Name is Red. The other, much less remarked one, is a threshold between the secular Turkish Republic of the 20th century, which has created this myth of national origins in pre-modern times in Central Asia, but has repressed its relationship to the Ottoman Empire with its Arabic and Islamic traditions. Now, simply put, many of your novels are provocatively positioned within an Ottoman context. I mean, not Snow. I mean, that's the exception to that, really, which is situated in the Turkey of the 1990s. But here's my question. Do your novels, however playful they may be in their mix of detective fiction, love stories, political intrigue, shifting identities of characters and so forth and so on, do they also aim to reclaim a forgotten history of Turkey, of your country, and of the city of Istanbul?
I did that partly. I mean, reclaiming a past, a lost history, of course, if you look from a bit from distance, has a nice connotations, and I did some of it. I really meant it when I did it, especially in My Name is Red. One of there is a naive side in me that went into making of that novel, that I was, now I call it is a bit more naive, that I was thinking that there was this glorious or Islamic, glorious and limited Islamic painting that dissolved between, in late 17th century, but especially in between 13th and 17th century, there was a particular way of seeing the world, making miniatures, their colors, their sensibility that went into production of these miniatures embedded in the books. So I wanted perhaps the little nationalist in me was happy when I was writing book, chronicling, reading books, researching, and saying that this whole forgotten tradition, I will put it on the pedestal again, glamorize it, put a frame around it, show it to Turks. I remember doing an interview in Holland, and also let me first put it that the whole tradition was also, since was illustration of classical Islamic allegories, Sufi tales, Islamic mystic tales, that the whole tradition of Islamic painting is heavily embedded in literature. There is no Islamic painting that is not illustrative, that everything, every picture that is produced at that period illustrates something. There are first texts, and those texts are the more or less classics of, I would say, classics. They were the classics of the Ottoman ruling elite. Just as an English gentleman should know his Shakespeare, these Ottoman clerks, bureaucrats, you may call them aristocrats, should model their reading on Persian literature, especially Persian classics. So they read them carefully and then illustrated these books. Once I said to myself, I wrote a book about the Islamic painting. I would be writing a book about classics of Islamic literature, because they were the best books, best scenes of those books were they were illustrated. So it was for me reclaiming that history which after 19th century suddenly deleted, forgotten, and in fact was considered to be after the modern republic a sort of passed away, a whole culture that is obsolete, that is unnecessary. So there was a little bit of a political motivation in that, or a little bit of a little nationalist in me who was enjoying bringing back that things that were forgotten. Then the little painter in me was also trying to raise his flag, saying that you like these pictures, Orhan. But on the other hand, I, at the beginning, and this is the most humane and important part of it, that I have seen and come across this Ottoman and Persian miniatures here and there in my old childhood, in my youth, but looking at them, enjoying them is not easy. I was here at Columbia when I began to plan for that novels 20 years ago, and I used to go to Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Islamic section, which is closed now, and I used to go there, and there would not be any single soul looking at those miniatures, only a Japanese guy who had lost his way, and was, and he would, that person would not look at the picture, but would look at me and try to realize, why is he looking at this? Because visually, miniatures are not as entertaining as big frames, say, in the second floor. The Islamic section is on the same floor. I used to, when I was provoking myself to work on these, visually like them. I forced myself, in that way, I forced myself to like these things. And in the end, managed to like it. I think we like works of art in many levels. First, we see them, they're visually attractive, we immediately like them. And then sometimes we don't like them, but we, for some political motivation or a little, as I said, little nationalist in me, or some cultural agenda, we enforce ourselves to like them. After a while, we begin to like them, or we deceive ourselves that we like them. After a while, we like them, we really begin to understand, we read about them and like them, and we also like, appreciate, congratulate our efforts of liking them. and after a while, liking a painting, which is at the beginning is, what is this? Is in the end, you're not sure whether you are really visually happy with this or you are happy for being in front of it and not being disturbed by it. And more it goes, and in the end...
And not being disturbed by scholarly commentary about
yes.
it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what he said yesterday in class.
After a while, we associate, identify, we say to our friends, I like that painting. Of course, it's like Bourdieu's distinction, which means I like myself when I like that painting, and I refer to you. Right. And it goes on to forever like this. So we also say this to ourselves. And then there is, in all this, there is so much politics and psychology of nationalism, reclaiming a past that is lost also in it. But then novels, culture is so complicated. One part of it, one part of our mind, spirit does that. The other part is very critical. The other part is cruel. My joke about it is that when I was forcing myself to like them, in Metropolitan Museum's Islamic section is on the second floor, and if you do a 2-minute labyrinth walk, you come to Monet's Impressionist part, and then they're so colorful, so overwhelming, that you understand, say, why the 16th century Ottoman Sultan also even imported someone from Venice to make his portrait. You understand the overwhelming presence of big colors and inevitable decline of that kind of seeing and representing the world. But then, once you understand that, you feel a bit embarrassed, a bit personal shame, and you want to like it more. And it continues like this.
Well, now that you've talked so eloquently about the pleasures of seeing, let me get back to the topic of anxiety.
Okay.
So you know, of course, Harold Bloom's book, The Anxiety of Influence, the anxiety of most, if not all, writers and artists in their confrontations with the giants of the past. Now, in Istanbul, you describe your first intimation of the thing that, and I quote, would nag me in later years, the self-contradiction that we only acquire our own identity by imitating others. Now, we often read about the great anxiety by writers and artists from the Third World regarding their first world models, and you already spoke a little bit about that earlier on. And you also address this issue very strongly in your essay on Mario Vargas Llosa, the Latin American writer, and you say there that, quote, a third world writer's exile is not so much a matter of geography as a spiritual state, a sense of exclusion, of being a perpetual foreigner, end quote. But then, when I read your essays on Proust and Flaubert, Gide, Dostoevsky, Faulkner, Bernard, or Nabokov, or whomever, or when I read Snow with its marvelous Dostoevskian resonances, I don't get the feeling that this anxiety of influence has cramped your style all that much. And on the contrary, in the Llosa essay, you yourself turn the argument around and say, and let me quote just one brief paragraph from that, you say, at the same time, quote, the sense of being an outsider frees him, the writer, from anxieties about originality. He needs not enter into obsessive contest with fathers or forerunners to find his own voice, for he is exploring new terrain, touching on subjects that have never been discussed in his culture, and often addressing distinct and emergent readerships never seen before in his country. This gives his writing its own sort of originality, its authenticity. So could you talk a little bit about how your relationship to all those Western authors and their often Orientalist accounts of Istanbul and Turkey has perhaps changed over the years?
But then there's a difference between being influenced by, say, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Proust, obviously so dominant figures when, if you want to be a novelist, and then that kind of Harold Bloom influence is relevant there. And there's a difference there's a difference between this kind of formal presence, or the presence of, quote, great authors, and those chronicles or travel writers who came to Istanbul, to my part of the world, and wrote about it, sometimes sugarizing it, sometimes in the manner of the Orientalists, sometimes flatly, or sometimes in a bad language. Now, these are different kinds of writing I have to come to terms with. As for what to do with my Proust, what to do with Tolstoy or Garcia Marquez, Faulkner, these strong presences, and then how to find my voice. In Maria Vargas Llosa article, since I can identify with him in the sense that he is from Peru, although he is writing in Spanish, a world language, that he had always felt that he was on the margins. But I identified with some of his problems, some of in waves that he represented Peru or the problems of Peru. I thought that it was a good time to say that there is maybe it's not in the translation, but I remember it's also in translation, an originality, which is, I refer to it as cheaply earned. What do I mean by that? No. Since we have a different readership, such different culture and such different social strata and such different religion and problems, even if you I would say photocopy these giants, but the cells, the texture of your subject matter is so different that there is an cheaply earned originality because the country is so different. My point being that if you're living in Paris and if you love Proust, the anxiety influence would be harder or hard to fight back if you're living in, even if you like Proust, then there are no Proust characters around, your subject matter will be, even the adaptation of Proust will be an originality. So I argue that you may be from living in a non-Western country, but at least no one will be reading your novels, readership will be small, so many political problems, everyone will be attacking you, no joy in being a writer, so forth and so on, but at least there is the anxiety influence or the originality is more or less, I think, can be achieved easily. While then we always complain that these authors are always copying the Western models. As for coming to terms with, say, Western travelers who came to Istanbul, wrote about this, a whole tradition, especially after mid-19th century, so many French writers came after the development of boats, steamboats, traveling from Paris, London, from Europe to Istanbul. Then at that you can come for 2 weeks. Then they begin to write a lot. And then there was a whole literature, especially between mid-19th century to the end of 19th century, because Turks did not, Ottomans, Turks, whatever you call them, did not write about these streets, this culture, this town, the way, which we may call realistically, like a photograph, chronicling what's happening in the street. Then they begin to learn it. But there is some 50, 70-year period that all these travelers came and they were in their memoirs, in their travel books, in their writings, were more or less writing what's happening in the streets, while Turks or Ottomans did not know about that kind of writing. So I learned a lot from them. So they were more or less photograph takers. I look at them at least in that way. Of course, they were all biased. Of course, Flaubert went after all the bizarre things, strange things. Of course, we know about all this. But then again, since Turkey was not colonized and Flaubert's interest in bizarre things or sugarization of the other writer does not really trouble me, and I don't find that as essential subject. Here is another material that I should also learn and come to terms with, I say to myself, not dramatizing and not making myself as a victim of the Oriental gaze.
Let's perhaps conclude our conversation, and let me ask you to speak a bit about your new novel, which is entitled The Museum of Innocence, and which will appear in English next year.
Hopefully, yes.
And parts of which, I'm right in saying that, right? You wrote here at Columbia.
Yes. I was here. It took me 5 years to write a novel.
Yeah.
In between, I wrote Istanbul, and in 2005, in March, in April, when I was in February, in March, I was writing it. Then, when I was here teaching these last 2 years, I was constantly writing it. Yeah, parts. Yeah, almost half of the novel is, by the way, written here at Columbia. How to tell? You know, maybe I'll tell sort of a New York Times bestseller list 2-sentence summary of the novel. I came across a good summary of the novel in Turkish internet. Someone read, a guy loves a woman so much that he makes a museum of her possessions. More or less, it's true actually.
But after the love is lost.
After the love is lost, it is it is about what happens to us when we fall in love. Spiritually, it's about that. All the readers who are interested in love stories will see a love story, but then I'm not glamorizing love. In fact, my book treats love as not a desirable thing. It's a bad thing. It's like some car accident, and when it happens to you, a realist, normal person would not want to continue with love, and just like my character, a normal person would only say, "My God, I want to return to my normal life. Please finish this." And my character hopes this happened to him for 8 years. Meanwhile, collects anything that his beloved, I would love to use this word, touches, because that it discovers the consoling power of objects. Then after this or that, I won't tell you the ending, then he exhibits them in a museum. More or less, the structure of the novel is that the annotated catalogue of that museum is the novel you will be reading. Then the surprise is that when I tell this story of people, that I am also doing the museum.
This is quite amazing. I mean, in a way, this is unique in literature, right? Because it seems as if the novel, as a form, is exploding its own framework and moving toward the real.
Yes,
toward the objects in the museum.
Confess that.
But what are the objects in the museum?
Oh,
I mean, what?
The objects we start with. My character, for example, collects some 4,200 and so and so cigarette butt ends of his beloveds. Most of them are marked by lipstick with various colors, and my curator and I are negotiating it with, and also lots of price bargaining with artists in Turkey to produce all of them. Because he collected them, but you cannot put regular cigarettes because in a museum, because they will deteriorate. So how to produce them? Or my character collects teacups, earrings, all the woman's clothes, all the thing. He visits the family as a distant, rich relative, and then enjoys dinner, watching TV, all the objects they use, all the things they do, kitchen objects, objects of daily life, that is, objects representing daily popular culture in Turkey between 1950 to almost today. I collected them. That will be suitable for a middle or lower middle class family. Then also anything that the novel touches, we don't notice. There are descriptions on objects in all novels. I have collected them. Most of the novel I wrote with an object in front of me, then my characters use. Then I will begin to see that we can also have a museum of Anna Karenina, that they can also, in Russia, go read word by word Anna Karenina, pick up the objects that is Anna Karenina use, and also use the novel as a sort of a catalog, annotated catalog of Anna Karenina. There are particularly novels who were, one day I will write an essay, now I'm self-plagiarizing from this essay that I didn't write. there are particularly some novels which are so appropriate for this kind of usage. One of them is Moby Dick. It is already an encyclopedia. It does give so much information about whale hunting, whales, psychology of it, history of it, that we take that book, illustrate with that with real historical objects, you will have a whaling in American museum. Then the book, then the novel will be a sort of a catalog of that museum. More or less, my novel operates there. I finished the novel. Now I'm doing the museum. I have a curator. With the first curator I fought, very typical. Now I have a second curator, and we are hoping to finish in 2010, hopefully. Yeah.
Well, I guess you didn't get a sense about the novel itself, that it is pervaded by a deep kind of irony. I mean, it's certainly not a kitschy kind of love story, triangular and traditional, the way it is in some ways.
Yeah,
But-
I confess I used lots of verbiage of love story in Turkey to promote the book. But then, but that's
Very
what the
sensible.
journalists like,
Yes.
and then I want, and that's why also a bit. I was worried about they will come with me all sort of political questions. I gave 6 years of my life to this book. They will all ask, so I've also used that. But then, my book is heavily about love, but it's never glamorization of love, never about melodramatic themes of love. While, since my character wants to be a Turkish movie star, lots of Turkish movie, just like Indian Bollywood, we have Yeşilçam in Turkey. Lots of stuff about Yeşilçam is in the book, but all the melodramatic themes of Turkish movies or Turkish movies are there with my cruelty, with my irony. I enjoyed writing it. I hope we will successfully publish it here next year with Maureen Freely's translation. Now, we're going to have an event next year. We are working with Maureen. The portions of translation are coming. As always, I'm troubled. I'm upset. We writers, when I see a new, I can only check English translation. Whenever I see Maureen translates and gives me portions of a new translation, I read it, I'm depressed. That's the beginning. And I talk to all other authors who are living in America, who are writing in other, say, Norman Manea, this Romanian writer. And I said, Norman, what do you feel when you see a translation? He said, Orhan, I'm depressed. That's the beginning of checking translation, because we have always imagined other voices, other colors, other strange nuances. Then you understand you're something else in that language. We'll do an event a week later about that.
Here at Columbia as well. Yeah. Well, one very last question. You don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but you want to say something about how you're enjoying teaching at Columbia? Self-serving question, you might say, but anyway, maybe the answer will turn out differently.
Honestly, the word that should be applied is not enjoy here. And to put it mildly, I have, just like perhaps producing books, making books, I really wanted to be more easy, more relaxed in the classroom, and I admire your easiness in the class. I'm more dramatical. I have not overcome the presence of the students. I always worry about teaching them rather than treating them as friends with whom we will friends who had read the stuff and with whom we will have a dialogue about the stuff. I should develop to a person like that, I understand. On the other hand, this class we have invented together not only to teach students something or to put together a sort of a series of texts about which we will argue and discuss and explore, but also that I was teaching something to myself, that I want to continue writing novels about visuality, about differences between literature and painting, especially about how the content of our thoughts when we think, what happens in our brains, how much of it are words, how much of it are pictures, what is the relation. We see so many things. Our eyes register so many visual information, but then we negotiate and pass that information through words. There is a center in our minds that immediately converts visual experience to words, and perhaps sometimes record the visual experience. Some of it, I think some of us record the visual experience through words, while some of us record visually. What happens, I'm also writing a book on now, The Art of the Novel. What happens to us when we read novels? Reading, especially fiction, I argue, is seeing the words, then more or less applying visuality to converting it to mental pictures. Even to simplify it, we read 2 or 3 sentences, then shoot a movie illustrating those sentences in our minds. Or perhaps some of us are like that. Some of us are more verbal. That some people register text as text, while some of us register text as pictures in our memory. I like to explore these areas because I'm troubled or enjoy about. I really like to think about, teach and learn and go deeply. So that class we are giving is about sources of this problem, tradition, the difference between painting and literature, verbs and pictures, and all the, from Lessing to Baudelaire, all the writers, philosophers, whatever, who thought about these issues. Lots of fun.
Yes, I would still say. Anyway, thanks, and maybe we can now open for some questions and comments from the audience. I'll just try to recognize. Yes, please.
Mr. Pamuk, could you please tell us how you feel you stand in relation to the earlier Turkish writer, Nazım Hikmet, in terms of literary and philosophical influences?
That first, he's a political figure in my life. That he is a political martyr, and he is a communist, as we all know. That I was, although I have left-leaning, leftist, Marxist inclinations in my earlier years, I was an introvert. I was not a social person. Politics in my early years was not a big problem for me. So I understood him in that context. I like his more, not political, but I would say romantic or sensitive love poems. He was an example of an author who was nationally famous for his dedication to whatever cause and literature. That was important. I liked him as because through his poems and letters, he was for me a typical Turkish writer in the sense that he was victimized by the ruling establishment. I like some of his poems, but that's all about it. Essentially, he's not a novelist. Maybe that's where the distance begins.
I would like to return to the fascinating issue of visuality. Some of the writers you mentioned, certainly Tolstoy and Proust, are at the same time very musical writers, in the sense, not in the sense of sonority, but in the sense that they build their narrative in a way of a symphony, with recurring motifs, variations, transformations, and so forth. So I wonder, my twin question is how you consider the relation between visuality and musicality, and does musicality play a certain role?
Okay, if you're referring to music as a form in which there is one melody, then a counter melody comes, so it's a compositional thing, I understand that, I respect that, I follow that, I try to do that. But if you understand, or the rhyme and pattern of if you read, or say Flaubert was reading his text aloud, so understand, feel the music. If you're asking that, I also like that kind of thing. But as for enjoying music and making it a part of the details or the texture of the story, I'm not a musical person. And sometimes when they ask me, I say, I am, really, I know about this, I'm a musical idiot.
Other questions or comments?
Yes?
Hi, I actually have a question about the second point that was brought up about Section 301 of the Turkish Penal Code. And since there was some recent changes that were made in that article, do you think that you would be charged in that kind of situation?
The good thing about the recent changes that it made it even harder to persecute me, because then you have to go to the Ministry of Law and ask, can I persecute this guy or that guy? And more or less, they made these changes because they want to continue to persecute people who are not well known, so intimidate people. Likes of me and other famous authors, which they persecuted, hit the newspapers, international newspapers, and is not a good thing. They want to continue to intimidate writers without making much international fuss. And that's the only reason they changed it. So it's not a matter of for me, but that famous people, at least for this government, will not be persecuted. But people who are not as famous or not as lucky as us, like us, will continue to be persecuted, and they are persecuted, in fact. Yes? Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
You seem to be talking about literature and book always somehow go to book. I mean, like literature as related to visual arts, architecture, objects, sculpture, and at the same time you were talking about influences and your Proust and Dostoevsky and all these great authors. But at the same time, I just wonder if you have ever considered James Joyce. To me, this, I mean, I'm not an expert in Joyce, but to me, the Finnegan's Wake is really the source of, those kind of media kind of things, going beyond the book.
My level is not Finnegan's Lake, unfortunately. A portrait of an artist as a young man is for me. Ulysses, I read with handbooks, and there I stop. Finnegan's Wake is an idea that I admire from distance. I accept my limitations. I admire him. I admire the depth and ambition of the whole venture and inventiveness, and also the modernist ethics of giving your whole life to that kind of ventures. These things I definitely admire. I also admire his inventiveness, his joy, his humor, and doing so many allusions, so forth and so on. But then, after a while, that kind of English is a foreign fantasy country for me. I have never been there. I never reached the shores of Finnegan's Wake. And I can, perhaps.
Yes, please.
How do you feel about living in the northeast of Istanbul? Do you think it influences your work in any way?
Well, this is not my first time. I'm not referring to the last 3 years. I wrote half of my black book, which I consider one of the first book that I found my voice. More than half of it here, in some 20 years ago, at Butler Library Cubicle. So I know how to write here. And this may be a cliche that if you're away from home, home looks sweeter and nicer, and you remember the details better. Even when you're home, you take notes. I'm going to go to New York for 6 months, so let me look at it in a different eye. So I'm not troubled by that. Sometimes people are jokingly asking me, now that you're teaching here, Orhan, are you going to write a campus novel? I say no. And that although I'm here...
Not even a New York novel.
Not even a New York novel till now. So I'm the kind of novelist who piles up material, plots, notebooks for new novels, faster than I write them. So there are so many unwritten novels, projects, they are all set in Istanbul. Even if I live here for 20 years, I will still be writing about Istanbul.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, please.
You had a lovely little essay in the New Yorker about Istanbul street food and about some of the emotions that come out when you start to eat away from your mother's table, and so the excitement and also the sadness and the profound alienation sort of comes from moving away from and losing touch with your traditional culture. I'm wondering if in your observations of American culture and society you see any of these themes mirrored here.
Well, that was a more eating outside of the home of a upper middle class mommy who wants to control. It's more about that rather than difference of cultures of Turkey and America. And also it's, but on the other hand, upper middle class mom has a point that once you're living in a big metropolis or a big city, then living in a big city, there are people who write about this, then is accepting the well-meaning attitude of the people you don't know. My mother's point is really was, in fact, I maybe glamorize it, but was anthropological. That if you live in a big city, modernity in that is you accept this guy. If you buy a Frankfurter, that he didn't spit in it, he didn't put some poison in it, he didn't do it from a horrible material. That he also cares about these total strangers. You can, and when, especially in countries where sanitary measures or governmental control is low, and my mother always threatened me like that, don't in the industry, do you trust these people? God knows what they will. He was arguing the communitarian argument. Only your mommy, your people who care about you, because they really care about you and they wouldn't put something nasty in the food. What if you put something dangerous, and I think they do, just because it's cheap and no government or no official checking of it, no sanitary measures? Living in a city is in fact based on that goodwill. But what if modernity comes fast and that implementation of that goodwill is not strongly developed in the so-called new citizens? Then horrors happen. Don't eat sandwiches outside of New York. That was my mother's point.
Anybody else? Yes, please.
It is very obvious that Istanbul has shaped you dramatically on the way becoming Orhan Pamuk. And do you consider yourself as a Turkish writer or an international writer?
I am, of course, a Turkish writer, not because of Istanbul, but essentially because I'm writing in Turkish, and I'm writing lots about Turkish subjects and Turkey. That makes me a Turkish writer. But, on the other hand, I am a Turkish writer also who is aware of this international readership I had gained. Now I feel the presence of this readership, but then that doesn't worry me. I'm so much buried in my Turkishness that I have no anxiety of having, am I a Turkish writer question. It's obvious. But yes, I'm a Turkish writer who sometimes looks at Turkish problems not in a different way. And that different way makes me, I sometimes think, an original Turkish writer rather than traditional Turkish writer. But then I don't worry about belonging that much. In the end, I worry more about being a good writer than being a Turkish writer.
Yes?
What were your thoughts about Turkish language? What advantages or disadvantages?
Wow, tough question. What are the advantages and disadvantages of using Turkish as a literary language? More or less the question is this, that we are troubled by the lexicon, limits of lexicon. Turkey is rich in tenses, rich in going to nuances of what would have happened if this was there are so many tenses, and it's really rich in them. And then in lexicon, in colors of lexicon, sometimes it's not as rich. Then in Turkey is, contrary to what everyone believes, is very good in construction, long sentences, nuances. And sometimes I add not only one single word, but sometimes 3 letters, which my translator should render with 5 words. And there are all sorts of, translating Turkish to other languages is really changing continents. But then you're not asking about translation, you're asking about using Turkish. But first, when you're writing in Turkish and you're a Turk and you're only addressing Turks, you don't even notice Turkish, you're just using language, you don't call it Turkish. Then once you begin to get translated, once you begin to talk with the translator, you'll realize that, oh, there is a Turkish term, this is not language. People who believe in God don't say that they believe in Islam, they say they believe in God. Then someone comes, oh, I also believe in God, but mine is Christianity. Oh, I'm Islam, then they say. So you write, then you worry about the language. You don't call it Turkish, it's part of your body. But then once you have international action, then you are meeting translators, problems of translation, sometimes 1 or 2, I wrote articles in English, then you understand, oh, English is such a continent, Turkish is such a continent. They're so different. I rely on translators. But then you didn't ask me. You asked the powers of Turkish to express myself. But then there is not much difference when we go to the origins. Powers of Turkish is powers of me. You never make a distinction. Only if you jump outside of Turkey, then you begin to invent and think and analyze and explore powers of Turkish. These things are all comparative, relative. So when I was writing, I was not thinking of powers of Turkish. When my books begin to get translated, or when I read books in English, I sometimes think of powers of Turkish. Or when I begin to, I'm here, I'm thinking of an article, and I'm writing a book, for example, sometimes an essay book that should also be published. Sometimes now, since it's also conceptual, I'm thinking that in English occasionally. It's not a fictive book. Then I think about powers of Turkish. But then when I'm naturally by myself, I'm not aware that it is Turkish. It's language. Then I'm troubled. It's a more of, is language a sort of a natural extension of my thinking, or is there a jumping there where I should do a lot of super ego to control, to switch sentiments, moods, things, ideas, to convert them to language? There is a superficial, not superficial, there is an artificial side to it. But is that the artificiality of Turkish or language? So you don't understand that. Powers and limits of Turkish is a comparative subject. The real subject is powers and limits of language.
Well, maybe on that, well, there's one last question perhaps, and then we'll close.
Let me ask you something for both your literary and political identities or hats, if you may. Your last comment on Turkish made me remember someone which this comment, I believe you were there, on the language as being universal feature. But of course, Turkish, English, French, these are natural languages which are extremely culture specific. So implicitly or maybe explicitly in my question, how do you deal with these issues of pluralism, diversity, and violence of our times?
But then these are not necessarily exclusively issues of language. These are social issues, not linguistic issues. Yeah, but then if you're asking what violence of our times, there is so much cultural violence that our cultures are heavily embedded in violence. But then maybe I make a political comment that there is something called terror as a political force, terrorism. I think civilizations, America's and Turkey's reaction to terror is exaggerated, too much, that we have to be learn to be a bit cool in our reactions towards all sorts of terror. I think all sorts of terrorist activity, and this is a concept that is being violent activity is abused in politics. There is violence in everything. There is a violent politics. There are also terrorists. Yes, but then the fact that there is also political terror is being dramatized and abused for in ways that I cannot accept. Violence is in the culture. Yes, we should get rid of some of it, but then I don't think it is an essential thing about the culture that I'm critical about. I may be more critical about lack of tolerance in my part of the world. I would more address that my part of the world, should we have to develop a culture of tolerance in Turkey? That I would believe and promote this idea. But violence is such a complicated concept that I don't want to understand cultures through that.
Topic for another conversation. Thank you very much, Orhan.
It was my choice.